In our last tutorial, we talked about how learning the keyboard shortcuts to the Edius program could really improve the speed at which you edit. And we recommended that everybody try and do their best to learn the keyboard shortcuts. And so in this tutorial, we're going to talk a little bit about how you can learn that. We pointed out last time that most all of the functions and features that are available under the icon strips, when you point to them, it not only shows what it does, but in brackets will show the keyboard shortcut that you could use instead of using your mouse and clicking on this icon. You could actually just start learning and using the keyboard shortcuts. People have written in asking, well, is there a list somewhere? How can I know what the keyboard shortcuts are if I'm just learning Edius? Is there some place where I can take a look at what that list might be? Well, if you have purchased the box, there should be a manual in there that might have a listing at the back of the book. But there is an online, and you can access that by going up to Help and Online Help. And I think if we scroll down here, we should, yes, down at the very bottom, keyboard shortcuts. Let's click on that and see what we get. See that they're kind of broken up into subjects. So if you want to learn the keyboard shortcuts that are associated with editing, click on that, and here are listed all of the default keyboard shortcuts that come having to do with edit. And there's a whole list here that you can check out if you want to find out what keyboard shortcuts to use when you're trimming or previewing, keyboard shortcuts related to the timeline. Well, you could open that up and start learning your keyboard shortcuts that way. And you could probably, I don't know, do a copy of this and paste it into a word processing program that might make it easier to access or print out and use it that way. Okay, so there's the list of keyboard shortcuts. And if you're just learning the program, you're brand new to even editing video on a computer, you could probably just go with the default keyboard shortcuts that are provided by Edius, learn them, and use them just as they come. However, if you are coming from another video editing program and you have built up a kind of a muscle memory of using a specific combination of keys to do a specific task, then you will probably want to go in and customize your specific keyboard shortcuts so they match the keyboard shortcuts that you are used to and have built up this kind of muscle memory for. And we'll show you how to do that. But before we do, I just want to show you a couple of things. I've loaded up a program here that I was just working on before I upgraded to version 7. And right now, I have not brought in my customized keyboard shortcuts. So I am still working, even though I have brought in an old program that I was working on, because I have not imported my keyboard shortcuts, I'm still working with the default. And so as I'm, working with this program or trying to make some changes, as I attempt to use the keyboard shortcuts that I'm used to, like say I want to expand out the timeline to kind of zoom in on a particular section of the program, well, I'm hitting the key that I'm used to using to expand out the timeline, to zoom in on it, and nothing is happening. And so what I have to do is actually go over and use the point and click method, find the little scroller bar here, and slide it along in order to expand out or zoom into my timeline so that I can work with a specific section a little easier. And now that I've got this open, when I try and contract the timeline and use my keyboard shortcut that I'm used to using, well, it just doesn't work anymore, and I have to go back and grab my mouse and slide this back across. So we want to go in and assign the keyboard shortcuts that I'm used to working with so that I can edit faster and not have to be grabbing my mouse and moving it around all the time. Another keyboard shortcut that I use 100,000 times a day, well, not 100,000, but 100 to 1,000 times a day, would be applying a default effect. And if you have ever watched any of my videos, you'll know that I'm kind of a dissolve freak. I I place dissolves as my main transition in my documentaries and promotional videos. I use dissolve a lot, probably overuse it. So I have assigned a keyboard shortcut to apply a dissolve. And I use the Control D key, Control D for dissolve. But right now, because I have not imported my keyboard shortcuts, that is not working. And the only way I would be able to add a dissolve at this point is to either go and look up what the Edius keyboard shortcut is for that, or do a drag and drop of the effect every time I wanted to place a dissolve. And maybe just to show you how to do that, because a lot of people do write in and say, how can I just add a dissolve to my timeline, to my videos? I just want to add a dissolve. Well, short of using a keyboard shortcut, you can go to the Effects palette, just click over to the Effects palette, find the transitions, click on that, and click on the 2D transitions, and you'll find your dissolve there, along with several other types of ways to transition between one clip and another. You know, you could use a blind wipe or a box, a border wipe, a circle wipe, you know, the traditional clock wipe to show time passing. But I like dissolve, and so the way we could add a dissolve is open up our effects palette, point to the dissolve, and press down your left mouse button and drag and drop that and place it in between the two clips of video, and we will have applied a dissolve. But that can take a lot of time. We want to set up a keyboard shortcut for that. Currently, or by default, the keyboard shortcut for that action is Control P. However, I find it very awkward to actually use the Control P. You almost have to use two hands to do it. And I like to keep one hand on my mouse. And so I want to change this to be something I can do with one hand. And ideally, what I want to do is change it to a keyboard shortcut that I'm used to using from other programs. I think it was probably Premiere Pro that used the Control D to apply a dissolve, and that's kind of where I built up my muscle memory for applying a dissolve. And so I want to set things up. I want to customize my keyboard so that by just hitting the Control D that I'm used to using, I will be able to apply my dissolve. Thankfully, we're not stuck with the default keyboard shortcuts that Edius provides. We can make as many changes as we like, and you can do that under Settings, User Settings, and go down to User Interface and click on the keyboard shortcut. And that opens up a window, shows you a list of all of the conceivable operations that anyone might want to do during the course of a typical edit, and shows you what keyboard shortcut has been assigned to that operation by default by the designers of the program. So, for example, if we want to discover the keyboard shortcut for delete audio filter on selected clip, well, we see that the keyboard shortcut for that is the F plus the Control key plus the Alt key. It's a 3-key assignment. You have to hit the Control, the Alt, and the F in order to do that. The keyboard shortcut for render between in and out. Well, as we look across, we see that it is the Q key, but also we must have the Shift key on as well as the Alt key. Once again, it's a 3-key assignment for that particular operation. Okay, you'll notice that a lot of them have no assignment, and these are often ones that a lot of people probably wouldn't use, but the designers of the program wanted to set it up anyway, just in case some people use a particular operation a lot. They wanted to at least make that operation keyboard shortcut able. Okay, well, let's maybe customize some here. Let's take a look at that default transition that we want to, how I've set up the dissolve to be the default transition. If you look up over here in our effects palette that's still open here, it will help you understand what I mean by the default transition. You can use any one of these transitions as a default transition. I just happen to have the dissolve set as my default transition, and you can see that by the big D that is there. Let's maybe just cancel out of this. If we were using maybe the circle transition as our main transition for any given program, we might want to change that to be the default transition. And you can do that by right-clicking on the icon of that circle dissolve and just go down and click on the Set as Default transition, and now the circle has become our default transition. So now when we go to our keyboard shortcut and we change that keyboard shortcut for the default transition to what I'm more used to, the Control D, well, now when we hit that Control D, we would actually be applying the circle transition rather than the dissolve. Really what we're doing here is setting up a keyboard shortcut not for dissolve specifically, but for the default transition. So now the next trick will be to find from all of this long list here which one is the default transition operation. And we could go down and look for default transition and see if it's there. Go down to the D's. Well, it doesn't look like it's under default transition. We could maybe go down to the T's and look for transition and see if we could find it there. Transition. And it doesn't seem to be there. Well, you can see that this could become quite tedious as you try and find the right operation in order to change the keyboard shortcuts. And the reason is because depending on the language that you're used to using, these operations will be worded differently. And Edius is a very international program, and for every language that it's been translated into, depending on the idea or the skill of the translator, these operations or the wording of these operations could be a little different than what you might expect. It might be interesting to point out that Edius is a program that was born in Japan and is currently residing in France, or at least I think it is now. I think I noticed something that even Grass Valley has been purchased by some other country, or some other company, I should say. So who knows where everything is happening or where everything is coming from these days. But as we look down our list here, it might be difficult to, or at least very tedious, to find the right wording of the operation that we're trying to change, or the keyboard shortcut to. Well, one way that you can probably find it a little easier is to use this little filter up here and think of the biggest keyword of what you're trying to change. And in this case, I would probably type in transition. And we'll see that our list now is a lot smaller, and it should be easier to find now. And we see here it is here, set default transition. That's the one that we're looking for. We see that it is currently set to be the Control key on and the P key. And as we pointed out, that is just very awkward. And so we want to change it to not only something that's easier to do with one hand, but also something that we're used to using from a previous program. And so what we do is, with that line highlighted, we will hit the Assign button, and we get a little window popping up that looks like a keyboard. And here all we have to do is point to the key that we want to use. The blue is designating the two keys that are in place right now for that particular operation. Well, if we just click D, then it will change from the P to the D. Now, let's say you wanted to make it a 3-key operation, by having maybe the Control-Shift-D as the keyboard shortcut for that operation. You can click on that now. If you lose your D, just try clicking on it again. Now it is a 3-key operation. Another way that you can assign these keyboard shortcuts is to actually press down on the keys that you want to use while this window is open. So let's say we want that Control-Shift-D. Well, just by pressing down on those 3 keys, I was able to assign it that way. I just want to keep it to Control-D, so that's how I will leave it. And when you've got it set the way that you want, just hit the Close button, and then just go and confirm that your operation has indeed been changed to the keyboard shortcut that you want, and then hit the Apply button down here. And now just to check that, let's hit OK. let's go and find a little spot in between two clips that doesn't have any transition at the moment, and try out our new keyboard shortcut, Control D. And if it doesn't work the first time, maybe just point to one of these clips so that our focus is actually on this particular track, the V1 track, and try again, Control D, and that applies our default transition, which is now the circle. Our new policy. Which is something we probably wouldn't want to use. So we'll delete that, go back up to our effects palette that we have open to our 2D transitions, and change that back to dissolve by right-clicking on the icon and setting that as our default transition. And now we'll try that again, and Control D. We now have our default transition, the dissolve. So you can see how you can change your keyboard shortcuts. Maybe we'll just do a couple of more. Let's go back to user settings. And let's set those expand and contract the timeline. So how would we find that? Again, we'd probably want to type in some big keyword to our filter, and probably timeline would be the one that I would try first. And look down the abbreviated list now. Well, it's not under timeline, so we need to maybe think of another keyword. Maybe zoom might give us what we're looking for. Yes, zoom in time scale. So rather than timeline, the word that the translator used was time scale. Well, that's interesting. Kind of gives us an example how these operations may not be worded the best and why it might be a little difficult to find them. But with persistence, you can find what you're looking for. And as we look at this, we see that the designers of the program have actually allowed for two keyboard shortcuts to be able to zoom into our timeline, or what we would say expand our timeline, and also two for zooming out or contracting your timeline. So we see that two are already assigned, and we could check these and see if that's something that we could live with. But we see that it's the number pad that has been assigned, the number plus key, or the plus key on the number pad. And depending on the keyboard that you have, especially if you're working on a laptop, you might not have a number pad. Or if there is a number pad assigned, it might be just too awkward to access. So we want to also assign this to not only something that's available on all keyboards, but also something that you might be familiar with from a previous program that you have worked with. I believe it was Premiere Pro where I learned how to expand out my timeline by using the plus key on my keyboard, or I guess it's actually the plus and equals key. And then contracting the timeline was with the minus key. And so if you are coming from Premiere Pro, and maybe some other editing programs use the same, and you're just used to making your timeline smaller and bigger using those keys, well, here's your chance to change this. Let's hit the assign button, and we will just go up, and for expanding it, we'll hit the, what only shows up here as the equal key, but it's really the plus key, and close that. And we see that that has now been assigned. We'll zoom out, hit the assign button, and assign that to the minus key. Let's shut off the control and just have the minus key. Close that, check, confirm that they're exactly the way we want. Zoom in is now the equal key. The zoom out or contract is actually the dash or the minus key, and that is exactly how we like it. Just check and make sure that there's not a dual keyboard shortcut set up here. The shift key is off, the control key is off, the alt key is off. So we're just working with that one key to expand and contract our timeline. So once we're happy and confirmed that we're getting what we want, hit the apply key. Let's close out of here and see if it works. Point to our timeline to put our focus there and try out our new keyboard shortcuts. We'll hit the minus key and we'll see that our timeline contracts. And we can see the whole video all in one glance. But if we want to work specifically in one detailed area, We'll just hit that plus key and be able to do some very fine close work as we have zoomed right into our timeline. All right. Just before we finish up our tutorial, I want to point out a couple of keyboard shortcuts that come by default with Edius that I consider to be quite dangerous, and get you to maybe make some changes to those so that you don't end up having some of the same troubles that I had when I first started using Edius. This is one of the ones that I consider to be probably the most dangerous keyboard shortcut that comes by default with Edius. And that is the keyboard shortcut to delete everything that is set between an in and an out. And the reason why this is dangerous is because you could have set an in and out point for a whole large section of your video, something like that, and that whole section is selected. But then you are going down further in the timeline, and let's say you've expanded your timeline and you're working very closely in a certain area, maybe for an hour or so. And then you inadvertently hit the keyboard shortcut for delete between in and out, not realizing that you actually hit it because it's been assigned to just one key, the D key. So if you're working along and your finger happens to hit the D key, well, nothing visually seems to happen in the area that you're working with, and you might continue to work there for another hour or so, and you might close the program out, and a week later you come back and open up the program only to discover that a whole large section of your video is missing. And you're wondering, you're scratching your head, well, what happened? Where's all my stuff? And so I like to recommend that new editors especially go in and change this dangerous keyboard shortcut to something that is very hard to hit by accident. So let's go up to User Settings, and let's change our filter to Delete to find this horrible keyboard shortcut. Here it is here, delete between in and out. And you'll see that currently it's just assigned to the one single key, the D key. So what we want to do is select that one and go to our assign and maybe assign it to something that's a lot harder to hit by accident. Make it 4 keys so that you have to be very intentional. You have to really be thinking about it. You're never going to do this by accident. You have to actually hold 4 keys down at once in order to perform this operation. And we'll hit apply. No more deleting big sections of your video by accident. Another keyboard shortcut that I find can cause problems, especially to brand new editors or people brand new to Edius, is let's type in toggle as our filter, and let's look for an operation called toggle insert overwrite mode. You'll see that once again it is assigned currently to just one key and is something that can be changed inadvertently by hitting that key without realizing what you're doing. However, toggling back and forth in between the insert and overwrite mode is something that completely changes the way that Edius works. And so if you're a brand new editor and you might be working late at night on a big deadline, and at some point in the middle of the night you hit this insert key on your keyboard by accident, all of a sudden your whole timeline is not working the way you expect it to work. And once again, if you're new to Edius, you might be wondering, well, what happened to the program? Why is it working like this? I don't understand. And you might just end up missing your deadline because nothing is working like you expect it to work. So again, I would assign that to something that's much harder to hit by accident. You might, again, want to do maybe something like the Control-Alt delete or insert. Or if you prefer, if that's something that you want to avoid altogether, you could just hit the Not Assign button, and now there is no keyboard shortcut that can possibly change the mode of which you're editing from insert to overwrite or overwrite to insert. There's another bad one like this. It's called ripple delete. We can find that one. Well, it doesn't seem to be under toggle. Let's change our filter to be a ripple. Okay. Yeah, here's the bad one here. Set ripple mode R. And so what, once again, this is just a one key setting that can significantly change the way Edius works. And so if you are used to editing with the ripple mode on and you inadvertently hit the R key on your keyboard, well, all of a sudden the ripple mode will be off. Or if you're used to working with the ripple mode off and you've learned how to edit that way and you inadvertently hit the R key, just the single R key, it's going to turn that ripple mode on, and you are going to be scratching your head to figure out what on earth is happening now. Why is Edius doing this to me? Because it just completely changes the way you edit. And we're going to maybe do a tutorial on what mode you are in and why it matters, and how that makes a difference in the way that Edius works. But for now, I recommend that you either set this to be non-assignment. Let's just hit it to non-assign, because I'll show you how you can toggle that ripple mode on and off before we finish up here. So let's hit apply. And over here, I'll show you how you can actually set this ripple mode on and ripple mode off. Right now, it is on. The ripple mode is on. But if we click on here and you see the little orange slash through the icon here, then we know that the ripple mode is off. And so when you actually have to take your mouse and point to an icon and click on it, then you're being very intentional. You already probably know what change that will make in the way that you edit. Otherwise, you wouldn't be messing around with these icons. And so if you know what change that makes and how to work with the way that Edius edits under the ripple mode or the ripple mode off, then by being very intentional, you can yourself control what mode you're in, and you'll know what's happening. The same here. You can toggle the mode between insert and overwrite with this icon here. So you don't have to worry about having keyboard shortcuts for these huge game changers in Edius. Just one more thing I want to point out, and that is that as you make changes to your keyboard shortcuts or make additions, you will remember how we pointed out at the beginning of the tutorial that you can learn your keyboard shortcuts by noticing how they are displayed next to the various operations that you do. But what about those that have no keyboard assignment? What is going to happen to them if we do add a keyboard shortcut? Let's say, for example, that we will want to use the sequence settings a lot, and we want to assign a keyboard shortcut to that. Let's do that and see what happens. Let's change our filter to sequence. Sequence settings, we see that currently there's no assignment. Let's make an assignment and maybe do an Alt-S. And as we look here at what this shortcut is already assigned to, we see that it says Extend Audio Track Display. Well, that's probably something I wouldn't use that much or ever really even know what it does. So I'll go ahead and hit yes. And by hitting yes, that keyboard shortcut assignment has been changed to the sequence settings. So let's close this, apply it, and notice now when we go up to our menu settings, we see that it has been applied to our drop-down menu. So now, where there was nothing before, as we start to look at the menu option now, we see that the keyboard shortcut assignment that we chose is now showing up in the menu option. And so these are very fluid. As you work with your program, you'll see that there are keyboard shortcuts applied to many of these options. Well, if you actually go in and change that to something else, that change that you make will be reflected in the menu item as well, so that you will always be able to just continue to learn how to use the keyboard shortcuts that maybe even you have assigned. They will be reflected in the menu options. Okay, well, I believe that does it for customizing your keyboard shortcuts.